To me, those effects, like 1 in 10 people changing their mind, seems huge. But there were several news articles whose headline was basically, study shows that AI is not very persuasive.
Wow.
So I think it all depends on your prior, like on the perspective
yeah.
that you bring to it.
Hi, I'm Laura Riley, and this is Research Matters, a show about Cornell researchers who are tackling some of the world's toughest problems and finding solutions that make a real difference in our everyday lives. Each episode will sit down with a researcher who's not just studying the world, but changing it, turning data into discovery and ideas into impact. Today's episode dives into a question many of us are already worrying about. Can artificial intelligence influence what we think, even who we vote for? We're joined today by David Rand, and you're going to have to take a pause while I tell you all of his affiliations. He is a professor of information science in Cornell Bowers, of marketing in S.C. Johnson College of Business, and of psychology in arts and sciences. His new studies suggest that the answer to the question I just asked is a very troubling yes. In fact, he has research that's just published that shows that simple conversations with AI chatbots can shift voter opinions in meaningful ways. We will talk through what that means for our democracy, for us as voters, and how we engage online. David, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Okay, so these two studies that you just published, which I've seen everywhere. So New York Times did a huge thing. Will Oremus at Washington Post did a piece. It's kind of like been everywhere all of a sudden. I imagine for the other faculty who are listening to this, they'll want to know, how do you get a piece in Science and Nature on the same day? Just like write a little script for that we can all follow.
So that was, it was very fortuitous. We had these two separate projects that were very similar, both looking at like how conversations with AI chatbots can change people's attitudes on politics, but looking at them in different ways and somewhat different contexts. And the projects were kind of proceeding in parallel, and each group knew about the other. Like, I told each group about what was happening, and there was some concern about like somebody's going to wind up getting scooped one way or the other. And just kind of through good luck, they both wound up getting accepted, one at Nature and one at Science, within a couple of weeks of each other.
Fantastic.
And so then I emailed the editors, and I was like, hey, there are these two papers that are synergistic. Like, what do you think about doing a coordinated release where they come out at the same time?
And then, everyone played nicely with each other. That is very unhuman.
Yeah, they conferred with each other and they went with it. So
that's great. Well, all right. So can you break down what did they each say and what was the synergy between the two?
Yeah. So I'll start with the paper that was in Nature. This paper looked at the question of, can a conversation with one of these large language model AI chatbots change people's opinions about really high stakes political contexts, in particular presidential elections or presidential competitions. So we did an experiment with Harris voters and Trump voters 2 months before the 2024 election. Mm-hmm. And so we recruited about a couple of thousand people, and we asked them how they, their relative preference for Trump versus Harris. And if the election happened today, what would you do? Vote Harris, vote Trump, vote someone else, not vote. And then we asked what issue was most important to them and why. And they wrote out about that and how they saw the different candidates' positions on it. And then they had a 3-round back and forth conversation with a chatbot that we told them they were talking to an AI, but we didn't tell them that we randomized the chatbot to either advocate for Trump or advocate for Harris. They have the conversation, and then afterwards we're like, all right, now let's return to the questions from the beginning. How do you feel about Trump versus Harris? If the election is today, what would you do? And so we did that in the US 2024 presidential election. Then we also did it right before the Canadian 2025 national election and right before the Polish 2025 presidential election. And all of which were like very high salience outcomes. And there's a lot of concern in, general society about AI manipulating people's opinions.
Sure.
But also there's a lot of work in political science that shows it's basically impossible to change people's attitudes about things like presidential candidates.
And you found what? So let's talk about the outcome for that particular study, and then we'll go to the other one.
Yeah. So we found that in the U.S. presidential election conversation, something about 1 in 25 voters who said they were going to do something other than vote for the candidate that the model was stumping for, switched to saying they would vote for that candidate
That
after
is a
the conversation.
shockaroo. So were these low information voters, or how did you select them? Were these people who were, dyed in the wool partisans, or how did you pick them?
It's a good question. We didn't filter on political engagement. We just essentially recruit subjects from these online survey platforms, and we said we want half Democrats, half Republicans. But we did ask about how important politics was to them and how politically engaged they were. And that was actually the biggest moderator of the effect, where, as you might imagine, we saw bigger treatment effects among less engaged voters because they sort of knew less coming in. But even among the highly engaged voters, we saw substantial treatment effects.
That is remarkable. Okay, and then go to Canada and Poland, because I think those effects were even larger, right?
Right. So like 1 in 25, it's like enough if you could get everyone to talk to the bot, and if it had an effect on that size,
it would have changed the selection.
Right. It would really have a big effect.
Could have.
Both of those are big ifs,
yeah.
But it's not a huge effect from like a percentage point perspective. It's bigger than what you would expect from traditional TV ads and things like that, benchmarking it against similar studies done in similar contexts using normal ads. These effects are maybe 3 or 4 times bigger than what you would expect with a normal ad, but it's still not massive. But then in both the Canada election and the Polish election, the effects were like 3 times bigger than the US effects. And so it was more like 1 in 10 people changed their vote to switch to saying they would vote for the candidate that the model was advocating for.
Mm-hmm. Do you have theories on why the effect was larger there? Is it that they're less inundated by political information over the course of a campaign, or what do you attribute that to?
So it's a great question. It's one of the obvious questions that comes out of this research that we don't have a good answer for, because with only 3 countries, it's really hard to know. They differ on many different dimensions. But my speculation is exactly what you said, which is that I think the media environment is just like way more saturated with presidential politics in the US compared to those countries. And also both of the candidates in the US election have been around for a long time. Like Trump, people have already heard a lot about Trump. It's really hard to come up with some new thing that people haven't heard before.
Sure.
Because one of the really important results from that paper also was that the primary way that the AIs were persuading people, it's not that they knew some kind of psychological manipulation tricks or whatever. They were just providing lots of factual evidence and arguments. I put facts in quotes because a lot of the time, or not a lot of the time, but some of the time, the facts that the model said were not actually accurate.
Yes.
But
I want to get into kind of facts versus persuasion in a little bit, because I think that that's a really fascinating piece of this, is that it seems like the more persuasive, the less factual, but
right.
But all right.
Yeah, but okay, so we'll get to that. But I think here that if the idea is that the primary way that it's persuading is by making lots of these factual arguments, then the fewer factual arguments you've already heard, the more room you have to be influenced by that.
Sure.
And so I think in particular, if it's saying things that you already heard, it's probably not going to move you that much. If it's saying new things you haven't heard, it's more likely to move you. And so, if you're a low engagement voter, or if you're in a context where there's just like less inundation of information, it has a lot more potential to actually change your mind.
So I think every super PAC right now that's, looked at your research has said like, we got to change our game plan. I mean, obviously in the New York City mayoral race, there was a very, very clear understanding for all of us that traditional TV ads were no longer cutting it. So, okay, let's move to the other study. What did the other study look at, and what were the results?
So the other study, which was in Science and led by Kobe Hackenberg and Ben Tappan, my colleagues in the UK, what we did was looked at trying to persuade UK residents on policy issues. So we had a set of 700 different policies, and they were randomly assigned to one policy, same sort of setup where they give their attitude beforehand. They have a back and forth conversation with the chatbot, and then they indicate their attitude. But the focus of that study was trying to understand what are all the different things that someone might do to try to make the models more persuasive, and which of those sort of levers really matters the most, which I think a lot of the lens that we were bringing to that was a sort of regulatory type lens, which is like, if you are interested in trying to prevent models from being super persuasive, what are the things that you should be worrying about? And so we looked at 4 different things. One is how big and sophisticated and powerful the model is. because, every time there's like GPT-3, 3.5, 4, 4.2, and
Sure.
5, every time they're coming out with these new, bigger, more powerful models. And what we found was that as the models get bigger, they get more persuasive, but not like massively more persuasive.
Is this because they are more human-like, or because they have they're scraping better stuff, or what? Like, what do you attribute that to?
So across all of the different things that we looked at, basically whatever made the model more persuasive also increased the number of factual claims the model made. And the differences in persuasiveness were very largely explained by the number of factual claims. So I think it's just like the bigger the model is, the better it is to marshal evidence. Also, okay, so we looked at how big the model was. It matters, not amazingly. Like making the models 2 orders of magnitude bigger in terms of number of parameters would get you a few extra points of persuasiveness. So, that's important in close elections, but it's not like you're in the domain of mind control where the model can make anybody believe whatever it wants to.
Okay.
Then we looked at personalization, which is another thing that people have talked a lot about. Like, what makes these models so great? It's that they can totally personalize to the person that they're talking to. And somewhat surprisingly to me, we found that personalization had quite a small return. Like, allowing it to personalize across various different dimensions made it about 1 percentage point more persuasive, which is equivalent to basically giving 2 extra facts.
Okay.
Which is not that much. And in the other paper, in the experiment in Poland, because we wanted to look at personalization there, this is some of the synergy between the papers, there we did what we call like a knockout experiment, where we had one condition where we told it you're not allowed to personalize. Just make general arguments that are appealing to everyone, essentially ignore what the person is saying to you, and just make broadly appealing arguments. And that worked just as well as whatever it was doing at baseline. So these are sort of 2 independent pieces of complementary evidence that personalization is maybe less of a thing than we might have thought.
Okay.
But then what we found did make a big difference was, first of all, the strategy that we told the model to use. We randomized across a bunch of different persuasive strategies. Some of them were the kind of psychologically informed persuasion strategies, like deep canvassing, where you really try and, appreciate the other person's position first and stuff like that.
But that is not personalization. Understanding the other person's.
It's these things intersect. It's in the personalization. Well, I don't know. So I'm saying that didn't work.
Okay.
So it's consistent with there's some personalizing going on there, but like there's that, or there's like moral reframing as another popular thing, where essentially you take the position that you're advocating for and you try and sort of rephrase it in terms of moral values that the other person holds. And so things like when you're talking to conservatives about climate change, you should talk about it through the lens of purity, and preserve like that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Okay.
So we did some of those kinds of things, and then we had tried to just give as much facts and information as possible, just pack it as densely with information as you can. And what we found was they all were persuasive, like they all saw significant shifts in attitudes, but the psychological strategies were the worst performing, and the just pack it with as much information as you can was the best performing.
So, all right. So the takeaway is just inundate people with facts, and they are putty in your hands. But I guess one thing that I found interesting is that these effects endure. So even if someone after the fact, and I know you've done a lot of kind of fact-checky type work I think you were like fact-checking journalist of the year or something for
fact-checking researcher.
Yeah, researcher of the year. So, this is something that's been important to your research for a long time. But so even if people have time to step back and parse what they've just heard or fact check everything they've just heard, there is an enduring effect. What AI is able to do to persuade sticks.
Yeah, but I mean, it's because, most of the facts and information it's providing is accurate. And you can be very misleading using only accurate information. Like you don't need
omission.
to lie.
I mean,
exactly.
Just like we all talked to our parents in high school, right? it was a lot of lying through omission. That's
right.
So yeah.
Exactly. We do find enduring effects in the science paper. We followed up a month later, and about 50% of the original effect was there. In the Harris-Trump experiment in the Nature paper, we followed up 5 weeks later, which at that point was 3 weeks before the election. So it was like maximal, what we call counter-treatment period. That is, they're receiving tons of extra information all the time. And we found that about a third of the effect was there. That is, to the extent that someone showed an effect initially, about a third of that effect was still observable 5 weeks later, which is, I think, pretty persistent to me in the context that, this is, like I said, it's a time when getting lots of other input. And, it's not that surprising to me that these effects are durable, because they're having this back and forth conversation where they're paying attention and the machine is giving them tons of information. And so to the extent that you make up your mind based on information, it's like a very intense treatment. Mm-hmm. And there's this classic literature in persuasion, the sort of standard theoretical framework in persuasion is called the elaboration likelihood model. It goes back decades. And the basic idea is, if people are really paying attention and engaged, you can get large, durable changes in attitudes by giving them relevant facts and information and product demonstrations and, credible endorsements and stuff like that. But if they're not paying attention, then that doesn't work, and you have to do all these more kind of psychological tricks.
It doesn't really depend upon, I know your colleague and co-author, Gordon Pennycook, does some work on intuitive voters, or people who maybe are less fact-based. Does it matter kind of how much information you start with as a consumer of this AI information? Yeah,
on the one hand, people that are more politically engaged show less of a treatment effect, presumably because they're coming in with more background information. We didn't measure Gord's favorite measure of analytical versus intuitive thinking in this study. In another study that Gord and I have run, I should say Gord is also one of the co-PIs on the Nature paper. In a different study that Gord and I had in Science last year on AI's debunking conspiracy theories, mm-hmm. we did measure that, this sort of tendency for people to think analytically versus deliberately. And you see bigger treatment effects among people that are more inclined to be analytical thinkers, mm-hmm. which kind of makes sense that if you really don't care about evidence and aren't paying attention, it's not going to work. But you have to be really on the low end of not paying attention to evidence for it to not work.
All right. So I have a question about the newness of large language models versus the old tiredness of traditional TV advertising. So is there a sense in which we are more persuadable or more susceptible to an LLM right now because it represents this unknown? We don't presuppose a lot of things about its agenda. Whereas, a TV ad is demonstrably partisan, right? Is that going to change over time as we have new relationships with these technologies?
Yeah, it's a key question. And we haven't looked at this directly in the context of political persuasion, but Gord and I did have a paper earlier this year in the conspiracy debunking context where we randomized whether we told people they were talking to an AI or we told people they were talking to an expert. And we see that people in the expert condition are likely to think it's a human that they're talking to.
Sure.
And it didn't matter. Like, it was just as good at debunking the conspiracy when they thought they were talking to a human as when they thought they were talking to an AI. So it's not about AI deference and just being like, okay, whatever the AI says, I should believe it. But I do think that this not realizing that the AI has an agenda is a really important part of this. We just ran an experiment a few weeks ago as a follow-up where we were trying to change people's attitudes about some policy issue, and we randomized whether we told them beforehand that, or we sort of reminded them, AIs may have agendas, and they're not necessarily objective, but they can be told to advocate for one side or another, and that made the models about half as persuasive.
Okay, so I do think it's suspicion of motive.
Yeah,
that may contribute to how persuadable some of these things are.
Totally, and I think that what that implies is, the potential policy approach that could be helpful to suggest is transparency, not so much around the fact that it is an AI, but transparency around who is responsible for it and who told it what to do, and ideally, what are the specific instructions that it got.
All right, I want to talk briefly about how what you've just found can be used for evil and then how it can be used for good.
All right.
So how are the bad guys going to weaponize these two papers, the findings in these two papers?
My hope is that these papers are not going to enable too much weaponization, in that I don't think it's like that surprising to people that AI can change people's minds. And my sense is there already are campaigns are experimenting with this kind of thing.
But I think the magnitude is pretty disturbing.
Yeah, okay, fair enough,
let's say that the Canadian and the Polish study even more so.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty big
that's fair
shift.
Yeah, it's interesting because to me those effects, like 1 in 10 people changing their mind, seems huge. But there are some other people that I've talked to that I think are not coming from a social science perspective, who are like, well, like 9 out of 10 people didn't change their mind. That's like a small effect. Like,
if you think about close elections.
I know. But there were several news articles whose headline was basically, study shows that AI is not very persuasive.
Wow.
So I think it all depends on your prior, like on the perspective
yeah.
that you bring to it. But anyway, so I think that the negative like use cases are, the most extreme is people using the models to actively mislead people. So making false claims, making inaccurate claims, persuading people based on evidence that is just like really not right.
Mm-hmm.
And, and then I guess the more general version is just the ability to persuade people with arguments that are like not fully representative. But, it's not that different from canvassing. Which is like,
sure.
if you think of political, it's
Except
an AI
that
canvasser.
Canvassing, you kind of know that there's a perspective or agenda behind.
That's right. And so I feel like, ideally these models would have paid for by, candidate attached to them. So with all of the like campaigns adopting the chatbot thing, the main issue is, how do you get people to talk to the chatbot? Mm-hmm. Like, great that if they talk to the chatbot, it'll change their mind.
Yeah, but what's the forum where we all,
like Harris voter like wants to go talk to a Trump chatbot or vice versa.
But if it's texting you as a canvasser,
right, or calling you, because voice to voice is also pretty easy. So that's
better,
that's one route. And then I think there's going to be a lot of innovation in political campaigning around how do you get people to talk to chatbots, basically. Mm-hmm. But a whole other mode of potential influence is, there are some chatbots that lots of people go to all the time to ask questions about all kinds of things, like ChatGPT.
Sure.
And, we don't know what ChatGPT's prompting is because it's proprietary, but it seems like in general, the goal of all these frontier models right now is be accurate and produce responses that the person will like. And there's some negative consequences like sycophancy and whatever.
Absolutely.
But like in general, the information is quite accurate. And I think that they have a lot of sort of like an explicit goal to make the models as accurate as possible so they're useful for people. But it means that, like, if Sam Altman decided there was some issue that he wanted people to feel a particular way on, you can just go in there and like tune it and be like, well, people ask about this, tell them that thing. And you saw that with Musk.
Sure.
Where like he didn't like that Grok was always telling him he was wrong when he said things that weren't wrong.
Yeah.
And so he put his thumb on the
anti-Wikipedia,
scale.
For sure.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, well, that's fascinating. So, so now how can the good guys win via, tweaking this for good?
Right. So the flip side of it is, these models are really good at explaining things and have access to a huge amount of information. So if you take models and you prompt them saying your goal is actually be accurate and just like correct misconceptions that people have. And again, if you can get people to talk to the models, they can be quite effective at explaining the truth to people.
I know you've done stuff on COVID, and I mean, there's obviously a lot of real ripe arena there for anti-vaccine information, or, so is that an area that you think there will be progress made in terms of disabusing people of wrong information?
Totally. So we started with conspiracy theories. And so we did this paper, but now we also have debunkbot.com. Cool. So anybody can go try it out.
Okay.
I did it with my dad at dinner a couple nights ago because he watched some documentary about aliens that he found very compelling. And I was like, let's talk through this. And it was great. It just totally broke the whole thing down, and like knew about the movie, and it had all what it was. It's very effective. And so we're doing experiments now where we're like taking social media bots and hooking them up to DebunkBot. And so they automatically go around and find people that are posting conspiratorial content on social media platforms and respond with, debunking. We've also looked at this in the context of vaccines. Like you're saying, we've got a few different projects on trying to address vaccine hesitancy and address concerns around vaccination. We have a project on climate, both on trying to address climate skepticism, but also, and I think potentially more impactfully, talking to people who believe that climate change is happening, but feel overwhelmed and like there's nothing they can do about it.
Sure.
Trying to make sort of concrete suggestions about what are things that you could do. And actually, when we were testing that, I was talking to it as like, you shouldn't eat red meat. And I was like, okay, I don't eat red meat, but my kids do. And it's like, oh, well, you should talk to your kids about it. And I was like, Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
And
why not?
I talked to my 10-year-old.
Or how about you guys talk to, you talk to my
that's
kids,
right. That's right. So
Get the bot to talk to them.
Yeah.
It's more persuasive than you are, probably.
Well, I guess that's true. Although I think I have some credibility still. My kids are young. Yeah.
That'll disappear.
But so I told my 9-year-old, I was like, GPT said you shouldn't eat red meat, and he was like, why? And then we had
or
to
eat cheese, probably.
We got a 2,000-word summary about why.
Yeah.
That said, like, beef was particularly bad, and he's like, all right, I'm not going to eat beef. And now he's like 6 months into not eating beef.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
All right, so we've got evidence right there.
Yeah.
All right, we could go on and on about this, I'm sure. But we have no more time. I would love to know, for readers or for listeners who are interested in this topic, what's your best pick in terms of a book recommendation right now? Or what should they be reading? What's a good resource? It could even be a periodical.
Yeah, I mean, one of the best sources, I think, of information about all the new and interesting and exciting or concerning things happening in AI is Ethan Mollick, is a Wharton professor that has a Substack called One Useful Thing that is really awesome. I was teaching an AI and society class, and I basically just went through all of Ethan's posts. I was like, all right, here's all the good stuff.
Great. Oh, that's wonderful.
And Noah Opinion is also a really good one.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. All right. This has been wonderful, David. I've enjoyed it every second, and I'm sure we could have heard, half an hour more about these papers alone. You've been listening to Research Matters from Cornell University. If you want to learn more about Professor Rand's work, check out Cornell Bowers College or the S.C. Johnson College of Business websites. I'm Laura Riley. If you like this episode, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and share it with friends who love facts as much as you do. Thanks for listening. And remember, when research meets purpose, we move closer to a healthier, fairer world. Thanks a lot.